Well, thank you very much, Michelle. And as you've already mentioned, you've really set the context for us in this conversation that I'm going to have with the former commissioner of the police here in South Africa. In fact, Michelle, he is the first police commissioner of the police under the democratic government. And let's get into that conversation with the former Commissioner Fivaz. Mr. Fivaz, thank you very much for giving us your time. Perhaps before we get into the nub of what we're here to discuss with you, talk us through, first of all, what is it that you do nowadays in this fancy office here in Centurion?
Thanks for the compliment that it's a fancy office. I think it's a great privilege to have you in our environment. We have a couple of companies, private companies, doing forensic investigative accounting work, security technology, and law enforcement training. That's basically what our business is all about. So it's 3 private companies, mostly involved with safety and security and law enforcement.
I see. Let's get into why we're here, Mr. Fivaz. You ordered a reopening of the investigation into Stompie Seipei's murder in the early years of our democratic government. How did that come about? When was it that you ordered this reopening, and why did you do it?
You know, it's of course a couple of years ago, and I haven't refreshed my memory in terms of going through the records again. So what I'm going to tell you is basically coming out of my memory. You know, I was appointed beginning of '95 as the first National Police Chief of South Africa. And during those years, of course, there were a number of cases that sort of stayed in the public domain as cases that were never solved in the past, in the old South Africa, if you can refer to that as the old South Africa. And one was the case of Stompie Seipei. The other one was, for instance, a case of, as far as I can remember, Winnie from the soccer environment. Right. So that type of cases, you know, continuously surfaced. And in the case of Stompie, I can recall Tony Leon. He was still a very active politician those years. He phoned me to ask for an appointment, and he arrived at my office with the family, and I'm not quite sure whether it was the father and mother of Stompie Seipei. You know, and we were discussing the case, and they were very much interested in knowing what is the status of the case. And that was, as far as I can recall, more or less in the middle of 96. You know, and the request was basically from the parents and Tony Leon, is it possible to reopen the case? And I discussed it later on with my senior people, and we have decided to reopen. And there was a media statement that we are going to reopen the case. I'm going to appoint a new, fresh, totally independent investigation task team to investigate the case afresh.
Let me ask you this then. So you were never influenced, or perhaps the best way to ask this would be, the person who influenced the reopening of the case of Stompie Seipei would have been Tony Leon, and it was not the president, the new president of the democratic government, or his minister of state security.
No, you know, I've heard so many stories that I was pressurized by President Mandela to reopen the case, that I was pressurized by President Thabo Mbeki to open the case or reopen the case, that I was pressurized by Sidney Mufamadi, who was at that time my minister, to reopen, but that's false. You know, basically it was reopened as a result of my meeting that started with Tony Leon and the family of Stompie Seipei, and afterwards we have reopened, and I've established this new team to investigate from the beginning, to determine exactly what happened with the murder, because it was clear to all law and sundry. You know, Stompie was murdered. So, and which they did, and they reported to me on a regular basis on progress.
And that's what I want to get into, therefore, Mr. Fivaz. What did that investigation unearth? What did you find out?
You know, the investigation team, as far as I can recall, comprised of very, very seasoned criminal detectives. You know, people that were au fait with the investigation of murder cases, of armed robbery and what. One I can still remember was a Colonel H.T. Moodley, you know, a well-seasoned detective. And they reported to me because I had an obligation to keep the media informed about the investigation. And on a continuous basis they reported, and it was very difficult from the very beginning, because from the very beginning they struggled to get all the documentation in the police docket. Some of the documentation went missing. They had to re-interview witnesses, they had to obtain new statements. But the end result, the bottom line is, they were not, and that was the final report, they were not in a position to find evidence of a constructive nature that linked Winnie Mandela personally to the murder of Stompie. There was not a single bit of information that fingered Winnie to say she was responsible, or not maybe personally responsible for the murder, that she gave instruction for Stompie to be eliminated. That was not found in terms of new evidence. And you know, if you go back into the history, you will see that basically in the middle of 97, if I can recall, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, started in full flare. And one of the very cases at the beginning that were a very high profile case was the case of Winnie Mandela. She appeared before the TRC towards the end of November, October, November 1997, and I testified in that specific case. And if I can recall correct, my testimony was basically around the issue that I appointed the investigation team. There was never political pressure on me to, except for the opposition parties that came to me early on. So my testimony was basically what I just told you. You know, that no evidence were uncovered, that was basically sufficient evidence to
link Mrs.
Winnie in any way to the murder.
But you talk about the new evidence that would have been discovered. I am not certain. I'm not. You're not telling us yet what your new evidence found, seeing that you could not link Mrs. Mandela. What did that evidence link you to then, or who was responsible for this matter?
You know, it was basically at that time, one other person was serving a jail sentence for the murder on Stompie, as far as I can recall.
Do you remember the name?
I can't remember the name.
Can I jog your memory?
Yeah, you can.
Jerry Richardson?
Yeah, that's it.
Yes.
Now that was, now I can remember. You know, that person was serving, but the fact is, if I'm talking about new evidence, you must now understand that I asked the team to do an investigation afresh, to start from the very beginning. So they interviewed basically all the witnesses that were known at that time, and that was still visible in the police docket, that people that were basically in the presence of Stompie before and after the disappearance of Stompie. And in terms of new evidence, I'm referring to the new investigation, you know, totally because I sort of disregarded the old investigation to a large extent, because it was discredited.
Why was it discredited?
A lot of people were saying, you know, the investigation was not done properly. And that is why they asked me to reopen. They were of the opinion, even the parents or family of Stompie was of the opinion that the investigation was not properly done. So I instructed the people start with the investigation as if there was not an investigation before.
Let me ask you this. Did your team members ever speak to Jerry Richardson, who, as you mentioned, was already serving a jail term for the murder of Stompie?
I'm convinced, you know, I can't say for sure, but I'm convinced they should have, and they would have, spoken to Richardson. You know, that was one of the persons that figure very prominently.
It would strike me as odd, though, that you have someone who's already been convicted for the murder of Stompie Seipei, but it seemingly you didn't take an active interest in Jerry Richardson in finding out whether or not he was serving a sentence for a crime he had committed. Why wouldn't you take an active interest in that
No,
person?
I think there was active interest. You know, you must remember, I was not personally involved in the investigation. I appointed a team, and it was a well-seasoned team. So I can only at this stage, 20 years plus after the fact, you know, imagine that that would have been one of the focus areas of the team.
Were you aware of information about Jerry Richardson wanting to stop or wanting to silence Stompie Seipei from disclosing that Jerry Richardson was in fact an apartheid police spy or informant? Did you ever come across that information?
No, I got that information as well. You know that Richardson was allegedly, and I'm not quite sure about it because most of the informer files of that time never surfaced. So there were allegations that Richardson was security branch Soweto informant, and he was basically very, very sensitive about the fact that Winnie Mandela would know about that, and that I can still recall. That came out of the investigation, you know. So the reason was also, and it's an allegation of that time, that Stompie was killed because he uncovered that Richardson was a security branch informer. I'm not quite sure. That was not at all substantiated as far as I know.
So it was never conclusively investigated and dealt with?
Stated by somebody under oath that Richardson was an informer. Except for the fact that I think that in some of the interviews with Richardson afterwards, after his sentence, he made that allegation himself, that he was an informer, as far as I can recall.
So it was Richardson himself?
Yeah, as far as I can recall, he admitted that, you know, he was an informer, and I'm not quite sure whether that was in a court case or afterwards or whatever the case may be where that came out.
Did you or do you know, Mr. Fivaz, of a policeman, former policeman called Henk Hesslinger? Do you know of that
Yeah,
name?
I know Henk Hesslinger. I know him.
Is he still alive today?
I think he is. Yeah. I think he is around.
Was he ever connected to this case of Stompie Seipei or Jerry Richardson?
Not according to my knowledge. You know, I'm not aware of that. If he was formally investigating the case, you must recall my position started as National Police Chief in '95, beginning of '95. I know Henk personally.
What do you know of him?
No, I know he was a good detective. You know, I know he was a detective at the murder and robbery squad in Soweto. Because I was a career police officer. I served in the police service for many years. And I myself was a detective. So I was aware of the fact that Henk Hesslinger was a murder and robbery detective in Soweto. I never worked with him personally. So I can't vouch on the quality of his detective work, but what I picked up, he was a good detective. He was a solid detective.
Can I tell you the reason I'm bringing him up? And the reason is that he is said to have appeared in a recent documentary about Mama Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. And in that documentary, Hank talks about how he was brought into the operation as early as 1994. And he is sent to prison to talk to Jerry Richardson.
Okay.
Jerry tells him that he was owed money by the police to the amount of 30,000 rand, and that amount was for him disclosing where Stompie Seipei and others that would have been kept in a safe house by Madikizela-Mandela. And so it was on the basis of him disclosing the venue of where Stompie Seipei and others were that he then would have decided to kill Stompie Seipei. Did you ever come across any of that information?
No,
Did you?
you know, not if you are talking about 94. Is it 94?
Yes.
94. I was, as a matter of fact, on an advisory board of Sydney Mufamadi in 94. That was before my appointment as commissioner. So at that time, the commissioner of police was Johan van der Merwe. It could be. I can't say no. It never happened. You know, if you are telling me that is part of a documentary, then most probably that happened. So not to my knowledge. Yeah, you know, I basically opened the case, as far as I can recall, in 96. Now that's a couple of years afterwards, 96, 97.
Mr. Fivaz, you will know, as a matter of public record, that Mama Winnie would then have been found guilty of assault as a result of being, quote unquote, an accessory to assault, and therefore receiving a fine and a suspended sentence. In your mind, and based on the investigation that you conducted, I just want to be categorically clear here. Are you saying that Winnie Madikizela-Mandela absolutely had nothing to do with the murder or giving instructions that Stompie Seipei should be killed?
Well, I'm convinced about it. As a result of the investigation and the report back to me, that and you know, in my testimony before the TRC, if you go back into the records, you'll most probably find what I'm telling you now. My evidence was based on what I got back from the investigation team, that they were not in a position to find evidence to say Winnie was implicated in the murder. I think in that same TRC hearing, Winnie admitted that a lot of things went wrong during that time. I think she admitted. You know, because I was basically interested in that case because I submitted my evidence in that specific case. But according to what I can remember, you know, nothing even in the TRC hearing came out to say Winnie was responsible for the murder of Stompie Seipei. I think it was basically proven as fact that a number of people around Winnie were assaulted and were not properly handled and whatever the case may be, especially members of the so-called soccer club. Yeah, you know, but really, to be honest and to give you an answer of integrity, in my opinion, nothing surfaced during the investigation that I ordered to say, Winnie, you were responsible. And that was my report back to the parents or the family and Tony Leon and the world, you know, in terms of a public statement after the investigation has been concluded.
Mr. Fivaz, therefore, I would imagine, therefore, that it would strike you as no surprise that many people out there and their conviction that Mama Winnie was the subject of a vicious campaign by the apartheid police to demonize her and to ensure that they mount a campaign to basically discredit her. What do you know about that campaign? Perhaps first, let me begin with the question that, do you believe that this indeed is what was at the heart of this entire story, that it was the apartheid police strategy to try and demonize her and discredit her because of the activism that she was involved in?
You know, what I can say is I had a couple of personal meetings with Winnie Mandela myself. So to a certain extent, I was known to the woman and she was known to me. She never made that type of remark to me. Even after the TRC hearing, I had a meeting and she thanked me for my evidence. And I said, but you know, Mrs. Mandela, you must understand, I was not here to do you a favor. What I did here today was basically to tell the TRC what I know as gospel. So it was not to do you a favor. So she said, no, but I just want to say thank you for your honesty. I never
and
picked
this was
up.
in person?
Yeah, that was in person, person to person. You know, I never picked up that, and I was not involved in that. I was never a member of the security branch. So if I tell you now stories about the security branch constructed or fabricated a story around Winnie to defame her or to implicate her, then I will lie, because I'm not aware of that. I'm personally, I was, I think, on a very positive footing with Winnie Mandela, because the woman impressed me as a very strong woman, a woman with, that's my opinion, a woman with a lot of character, a woman with a very firm grip when she greets you, a woman with a very strong view of life and what should happen. I never had the feeling that some people would have been involved in a sinister type of plot. That was not, to my knowledge, to discredit Winnie.
Because that was the question I was actually going to ask you, that as a policeman who operated under that era, the apartheid regime, yes, you say you were not part of the security branch, but the question I was going to ask you is, what did you know of the workings of the so-called Stratcom of the apartheid police, and specifically in relation to Winnie Mandela?
You know, I basically got more knowledge after 94-5 about the workings of the security branch than I got when I was in the police service before 94, because it was a unit all on its own, and we know about the existence, and we know about the fact that they are working with the internal security legislation of the country. And of course, you were not blind, and you were listening to a lot of news flowing around about atrocities by the security branch and whatever. But I never got substantive information before 95 that Winnie was the target of a specific stratcom.
Post 95, when you were now in charge?
No, most definitely not.
You still didn't get
No, most definitely not, because there was an open door relationship between myself, Madiba, and specifically Winnie Mandela. You know, there was no sinister plots after that, I can assure you.
No, I'm talking now in relation to you as the man in charge of the police. You never came across information that actually the security branch had a particular campaign, a well-orchestrated campaign against Winnie Mandela.
No,
I'm saying, did you ever come across information?
I would lie if I say I don't know anything about Winnie and the security branch. As a matter of fact, everybody in South Africa knows by now she was incarcerated, you know, and she was a topic of the security branch for many, many, many years. You know, and of course the security branch focused on Winnie. She was a topic. She was a subject. And I can only imagine that the security branch made it their business to know about the movements and the goings and comings of Winnie Mandela. You know, that was the way they do their work, and that was the reason of their existence. So obviously, you know, they were highly interested in Winnie.
So therefore, having come across this information and having known, therefore, what their focus was, would it be your honest opinion that the campaign to demonize Mrs. Mandela actually succeeded?
To a large extent, you know, I think the gossiping, take the Seipei case specifically. You know, till today, a lot of people are saying she murdered Stompie. You know, now somebody is still feeding the international media with the story, Winnie was the killer of Seipei. Now, I'm telling you, after a proper investigation, we never found anything to substantiate that claim. That per se, I think, is sufficient evidence to say, of course, there were attempts by somebody, somewhere along the line, to make the woman a culprit, and there was no evidence. The rest of the accusations against Winnie for fraud and for corruption in the housing scheme investigation, you know, that was a different story. And she was before court and she was sentenced, and that was something behind, and there was sufficient evidence. But in the case of Stompie, I think there was a malicious, deliberate attempt, in my opinion, to take that murder case and to put it on the lap of Winnie and to say Winnie was responsible for that murder. And I can say honestly, from the investigation we have done totally independently, without any motive, because there was no motive for me to cover up in whatever way. There was no evidence to implicate Winnie in the Seipei murder case.
Did you ever take an interest in other related cases? For example, and I'm going to give you specific names, Lolo Sono, Sbusiso Chabalala, Gabriel Mihwe. Did those names ever come
Those names
to your attention?
came up, and I mentioned Xoli Mngambi, the soccer man.
Yeah.
You know, those names came up. But those cases were not cases that form part of a special investigation unit that was established by me personally. I know the head of the detectives, made it a very specific focus area to look into those cases. And we made sure, just to make sure the people grow in confidence around the new police service.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people were saying, you know, in the old era, nothing was properly investigated. They investigated what was in favor of the apartheid regime, and the rest they just left by the wayside. Now, all those cases were picked up later on and re-investigated to make sure that we can at least tell the people out there honestly, you know, we have tried our level best to find something new. We found something new, and there is a new process going on, or it wasn't possible. So yes, yeah, you know, I took note of that. And as a matter of fact, a lot of these cases were also reported to me in terms of what we call in the police service information notes. You know, because it was cases of public interest.
Yes.
It was reported to me in terms of information notes to say the investigation is going on, it's continuing, so far we have uncovered this or what. So of course, you know, I took interest in that.
So, but ultimately, you left office, and you would have left the office in 2000. So nothing would have been discovered by the time you left. But what did you think then when, in many years later, it was actually in March of 2013, that then the bodies of Lolo Sono and Sibusiso Chabalala are discovered at the Avalon Cemetery,
yeah.
And they were in unmarked graves. What came to mind? I mean, I know that the investigation clearly would have not given you anything before you left office.
Yeah, no, you know what? There are still a lot of question marks in my mind as well about issues I got to know about the first time before the TRC. And I was always asking myself, and I had numerous discussions with President Mandela and Thabo Mbeki and Sidney Mufamadi. How was it possible for a person that was now a career police officer like myself, was never aware of this thing happening basically in front of your eyes? You know, and it was done properly, it was done covertly by the security branch, all these things. And obviously it was dealt with as top secret, and we were doing our normal job as a police officer, investigating crime and fighting criminals and whatever the case may be, and trying to do a decent police job. And in the meantime, some other sinister things happened, and we were not aware of that.
Did you ever take an active interest in the Mandela Football Club? Because they were said to be a very rampant bunch, especially in the township, going after those who were allegedly spying for the police. Did you ever take an active interest in them?
I know about it. I know about the team.
Yes.
And during this investigation, I'm telling you about the reopening. Many report backs were done to me about the team, the activities, and the robust way in which the team was doing certain things and going around. But before that, I was not even aware of the Mandela soccer team. Yeah, you know, of course, later on, even before the TRC, you know, there were testimony in detail about the soccer team and the activities. And of course I took note. But before 95, I was not even really, seriously not even aware of the existence of the team. And it's maybe because the activities of the police service are to a large extent localized. You know, the people in Soweto and the detectives of Soweto, they most definitely would have been well aware of the activities, and they would have focused on the team, but that was supposed to be regional, localized police issues.
Mr. Fivaz, having spoken about all of this, you conducted an investigation, you then subsequently went to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to testify, among others, about this particular case of Stompie Seipei. The information you gave and the information uncovered by your team, is it something that you would say you would stand by? It was your honest and faithful testimony, that it is something that you will go to the grave knowing that you really gave an honest account?
I can say that without doubt in my mind. That, the team I established at that time was a capacitated team in terms of experience. They knew exactly how to investigate this type of thing, murder cases and whatever the case may be. They seriously tried their level best to unravel the situation and to make sense out of all these allegations that Winnie was responsible, and they never made a dent into that. They never got any substance. So, yes, I will go to grave saying, in my opinion, I have to have faith in what I've done, and up till today, I'm convinced Winnie was not responsible for the murder of Stompie Seipei. That is my honest opinion.
Just as a final question, as I wrap up this interview, what's your lasting memory of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela? You've spoken about her very, very glowingly, as many people have. I'm just wondering what your abiding memory of her is.
What I want to repeat is that there are some people in life that has a presence around them, an aura. And Winnie was definitely one of them. When she enters, you are aware of somebody with you. It was the same type of feeling I got from Madiba. People with a very specific aura and a strong personality. She had a very strong personality and a very warm personality. The couple of times I spoke to Winnie, I was very impressed about the neatness of the woman in general. Yes. Very attractive woman, beautiful hands. She had the most beautiful hands, and well looked after fingernails, and well groomed, and well mannered. So in terms of my last impression is a wonderful woman in terms of my knowledge. Maybe some unfortunate things happened around the corner, and we are picking that up in the media. But in terms of my association with Winnie Mandela, it was only a pleasant and a memorable type of nice feeling that I knew the person.
Mr. Fivaz, thank you very much for your time.
Great pleasure.
Truly appreciate it.
Great pleasure.
Thanks indeed for inviting us. Thank you very much. Well, Michelle.
You are welcome to come again.
Thank you. Well, Michelle, that was the former commissioner of the police. In fact, the first police commissioner under the democratic government. He took office in January of 1995, having been appointed by former President Nelson Mandela. And we have been in conversation with him about specifically, Michelle, the story of Stompie Seipei that has really become a huge talking point at a time when, of course, the struggle icon of the struggle, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, passes. And it was important that we attempt in all effort to try and clear the air around this issue. So hopefully the viewers have gotten something today from that particular investigation.
Well, thanks very much for that. Our senior political reporter, Xoli Mngambi, and as he said, the former police commissioner, George Fivaz, in conversation. Some interesting insights certainly coming out of that interview, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to replay it for you if you didn't manage to catch the entire thing. It's